The night was still in the rolling hills of the Transkei, where the stars shone like shards of diamonds scattered across the vast African sky. A boy named Ralila, whose very name in Xhosa meant pulling the branch of a tree or troublemaker, lay awake in a small hut, unaware that history would one day know him as Nelson Mandela. It was July 18, 1918. In the tiny village of Mvizo, where the heartbeat of the land was the sound of cattle bells and the rustling of the wind through the grass. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakeni-Iswa, a chief of the Thembu people, carried the weight of tradition in his posture. His mother, Nosakini Fanny, held the warmth of the family in her hands. They lived in a South Africa still under the crushing weight of colonial rule, a land where black South Africans were subjects in their own home. From the beginning, the boy's life was shaped by loss and the currents of history. His father's refusal to bow to a white magistrate's orders cost him his position as chief. When Mandela was just 9, Gadla died of an illness that swept through their village like a shadow. The boy's world shifted. His mother, seeking a future for him, took him to Kunu and entrusted him to the care of Chief John Tabadal Ndibo, the acting regent of the Thembu people. In the regent's household, Mandela was given not only shelter, but the path to an education, a rare and precious key in society, where the color of one's skin dictated the gates one could pass through. The regent believed deeply in preparing the next generation of leaders, even in a time when the white minority government tightened its grip on every aspect of life. South Africa was still decades away from formal apartheid, yet the soil was already poisoned with segregation. Mandela grew up hearing stories of his ancestors' bravery, of warriors who fought to defend their land from British colonial forces. Around the evening fires, elders spoke in solemn tones about the Thembu kings and the battles that shaped their people. Those tales seeped into Mandela's heart, planting seeds of pride and a restless longing for justice. He attended the Methodist mission school, where a teacher, unable or unwilling to pronounce Ralila, gave him a new name, Nelson. It was a common practice in colonial schools, stripping African children of their native names and identities, replacing them with something more palatable to British ears. Mandela accepted it quietly, but deep inside, he understood what was being taken from him. Education became his weapon, one he wielded with discipline. He moved on to Heldtown, a strict boarding school, where he learned not just from textbooks, but from the unspoken codes of survival in a white-dominated society. By the time he entered the University College of Fort Hare, one of the few higher education institutions open to black South Africans, Mandela's mind was a forge of ambition. Fort Hare was a place where the young and the gifted gathered, future lawyers, teachers, and leaders in the making. But it was also a place where defiance took root. In 1940, a student boycott erupted over quality of food and the administration's disregard for student rights. Mandela, drawn into the protest, refused to back down. The regent, disappointed by what he saw as reckless disobedience, withdrew his support. To Mandela, it was the first clear fracture between the path laid out for him and the one he would choose for himself. Rather than return to a life bound by tradition, Mandela fled to Johannesburg, a city pulsing with contradictions. Gold mines carved into the earth, fortunes made and lost in the shadows of skyscrapers, and the harsh reality of black townships surrounded by barbed wire and white-owned factories. Johannesburg was the beating heart of South Africa's economy, but it was also the nerve center of its racial oppression. Here, past laws dictated where black men and women could live, work, and walk. Police raids were constant. Signs on public benches, buses, and buildings declared in bold letters, "Europeans only." Mandela took a series of jobs, security guard, clerk, until a chance connection led him to Walter Sisulu, a man who would become a lifelong friend and comrade. Sisulu, a real estate agent with deep ties to political activism, saw in Mandela a sharp mind and an unyielding spirit. He introduced him to the law firm of Lazar Seidelsky, one of the few white lawyers willing to mentor young black South Africans. Here, Mandela learned not just legal statutes, but the mechanics of how laws could be bent and twisted to enshrine inequality. It was Sisulu who drew him toward the African National Congress, a political organization that had been advocating for the rights of black South Africans since 1912. The ANC at the time was largely committed to petitions and polite appeals to the white government, tactics that had achieved little more than being ignored. But among the younger members, a new fire was burning. They believed that only mass mobilization could shake the pillars of white supremacy. In 1944, Mandela Sisulu and Oliver Tambo co-founded the ANC Youth League, determined to push the movement into a more radical, confrontational direction. The political climate in South Africa was darkening. In 1948, the National Party swept into power, formally instituting apartheid, an all-encompassing system of racial segregation that would dictate every moment of life. Black South Africans were stripped of citizenship, herded into homelands, and denied basic human rights. It was not merely a social system, it was a legal cage. For Mandela, there was no turning back. His legal work expanded into defending those charged under unjust laws, and his political speeches grew sharper, calling for strikes, protests, and civil disobedience. The more he rose, the more the government took notice. Police trailed him. Informants tried to infiltrate meetings. The stakes were rising with every passing month. Yet Mandela's resolve deepened. He studied the tactics of leaders like Gandhi, whose nonviolent resistance in South Africa decades earlier had rattled the British Empire. But Mandela also understood that the apartheid regime was prepared to meet peaceful protests with bullets. He wrestled with this truth, feeling the pull between patience and the urgency of action. By the early 1950s, Mandela's public profile had made him a symbol of defiance. In 1952, the ANC launched a defiance campaign, a nationwide movement to deliberately break apartheid laws. Thousands were arrested, including Mandela himself. Facing a prison sentence, he stood in the dock and refused to apologize, declaring that his actions were rooted in justice and humanity. It was here that the authorities began to see him not just as a troublemaker, but as a threat to the very foundation of their rule. And in the shadows, forces were already moving to ensure that this rising leader would not remain free for long. Mandela's arrest during the Defiance campaign had only emboldened his resolve. Though sentenced to 9-month imprisonment, suspended for 2 years, the courtroom had become his stage, his words echoing far beyond its walls. In the streets, the government intensified its crackdown. Police raids on homes, mass arrests, and the banning of political gatherings became part of daily life for those daring to challenge apartheid. Despite the risks, Mandela and his allies pushed forward. He and Oliver Tambo opened South Africa's first black-owned law firm, Mandela and Tambo, in central Johannesburg. Their small office became a sanctuary for those without hope, minors dismissed without cause, women evicted from their homes, families torn apart by past laws. Clients queued in the narrow hallway, their faces lined with fatigue, clutching documents and notices heavy with the language of injustice. Mandela worked late into the night, often without payment, because each case was another battle against the machinery of oppression. The apartheid regime responded with legislative force. The Suppression of Communism Act, though aimed broadly, became a weapon to silence any form of dissent. Mandela was placed under his first banning order in 1952, forbidding him from attending gatherings or leaving Johannesburg without permission. It was intended to cut him off from the movement. Instead, it taught him how to operate in secrecy, how to communicate through trusted couriers, how to move quietly while still stirring the waters of resistance. By 1955, the ANC was working to unite a broad coalition against apartheid. In a daring move, they organized a Congress of the People in Kliptown, drawing delegates from across the country, black, white, Indian, and colored South Africans, despite government harassment. It was here that the Freedom Charter was adopted, a document declaring, "South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white." Its vision was radical, not only rejecting apartheid, but reimagining the nation as a democracy rooted in equality. Mandela saw in the charter a blueprint for the future, but the government saw it as treason. The response came swiftly. In December 1956, Mandela and 155 others were arrested and charged in what became the treason trial, a marathon legal ordeal that would stretch over 4 years. The courtroom was a theater of intimidation, police lining the walls, prosecutors reading charges designed to paint the accused as dangerous revolutionaries. Yet inside those walls, a sense of solidarity flourished. The accused formed bonds, shared strategies, and transformed the trial into a platform to expose the brutality of apartheid to the world. During the trial, Mandela's personal life shifted in ways that tested his endurance. His marriage to Evelyn Mays, strained by his long absences and the constant pressure of political life, came to an end. It was a painful rupture, compounded by the knowledge that his devotion to the struggle came at the cost of stability at home. In 1958, he married Namzmo Winifred Madikizela Winnie, a young social worker whose courage and commitment to the cause matched his own. Together, they would face the storms to come. By 1960, the political landscape was erupting. In March, thousands gathered in the township of Sharperville to protest past laws, refusing to carry the identification documents that controlled their movement. Police opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing 69 people, many shot in the back as they fled. The massacre sent shockwaves through the country and the world. The government declared a state of emergency, banning the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress outright. Leaders were arrested en masse. For Mandela, Sharperville was a turning point. Years of peaceful protest had been met with bullets and blood. He began to conclude that nonviolent resistance, while morally powerful, was not enough to dismantle a regime willing to kill without hesitation. In 1961, after the treason trial ended in acquittal, he and other leaders formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC. Their mission was not to target civilians, but to sabotage government infrastructure, power plants, rail lines, communication systems. It was a shift that would change the course of his life forever. Mandela operated underground, moving between safe houses, disguising himself to avoid capture. The press began calling him the Black Pimpernel, a man who could appear and vanish at will. He traveled secretly across Africa, seeking support and training for the armed struggle, and visited London to rally international backing for the cause. Everywhere he went, he carried the weight of a question that would define his legacy. How far was he willing to go for freedom? In August 1962, that question was answered not in action, but in betrayal. Acting on a tip, rumored to have come from a foreign intelligence agency, the police intercepted Mandela near Howick. He was arrested and charged with incitement and leaving the country illegally. The courtroom became once more his battlefield. Sentenced to 5 years in prison, he was sent to the notorious Pretoria local prison, but the state was not finished with him. In July 1963, police raided a farm in Rivonia, north of Johannesburg, where they uncovered documents linking Mandela and his comrades to Umkhonto we Sizwe's sabotage campaign. He was brought from prison to stand trial again, this time facing charges that carried the death penalty. As the Rivonia trial opened, the world watched. Mandela stood in the dock, calm, unflinching, prepared to speak not just for himself, but for every South African denied freedom. And when he rose to deliver his statement from the dock, he began with words that would echo across generations. He looked directly at the court, his voice steady but charged with the weight of centuries. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. Mandela declared, "It is an ideal for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But, my lord, if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The silence that followed was electric, an unspoken recognition that this man was no ordinary defendant. He was offering his life as collateral for the freedom of his people. The Rivonia trial stretched on for months, each day carrying the possibility that the judge might sentence the accused to hang. Outside South Africa, protests erupted in cities across the world, demanding the release of Mandela and his comrades. Diplomatic pressure mounted, but the apartheid government remained unmoved. On June 12, 1964, the court delivered its verdict. Mandela and 7 others were found guilty of sabotage. But instead of the gallows, they were sentenced to life imprisonment. The state had decided that a living Mandela locked away, cut off from the world, might be less dangerous than a martyr whose death could ignite a revolution. He was sent to Robben Island, a wind-swept outcrop in the Atlantic Ocean, visible from the glittering skyline of Cape Town, yet utterly isolated. The prison was a fortress of stone and steel, where the cells were barely larger than a man's outstretched arms. Prisoners were forced into grueling labor in a lime quarry, their eyes burning from the blinding white dust. Guards subjected them to humiliations designed to break the spirit. Reduced rations, bans on reading materials, letters censored to a few tightly written lines. Mandela, prisoner number 466/64, refused to yield. In the quarry, he worked alongside men who had given decades to the struggle, speaking in hushed tones as they broke rocks under the sun. At night, he studied law, politics, history through correspondence courses. The lime dust damaged his eyesight permanently, but he continued to read, to write, to lead. His cell became a school, his calm resolve a source of strength for younger inmates. Over the years, he learned the art of patience. He memorized the names and stories of every prisoner. He listened as much as he spoke. He cultivated discipline, never allowing the guards to see weakness, never letting anger cloud his strategy. Even when denied the right to attend the funerals of his mother in 1968 and his eldest son Thembekile in 1969, he carried his grief in silence, determined that the warders would not see his pain as victory. Outside the prison walls, South Africa was changing, but not enough. The apartheid regime, under leaders like Hendrik Verwoerd and later P.W. Botha, expanded its grip, yet resistance was growing. The Soweto uprising in 1976 saw school children take to the streets to protest being taught in Afrikaans. Police gunfire killed hundreds, shocking the world. The struggle intensified and Mandela's name became a rallying cry for a new generation. Posters bearing his face, though he had not been photographed in years, appeared in foreign capitals. Free Nelson Mandela became a chant that echoed through concerts, marches, and parliament from London to Sydney. The government occasionally offered Mandela conditional release, renounce violence, and you can walk free. He refused each time. To him, freedom bought at the price of abandoning the struggle was no freedom at all. By the 1980s, international sanctions and boycotts were beginning to bite. South Africa's economy strained under the weight of isolation. Inside the prison, Mandela was moved to Pollsmoor Prison in 1982, a sign that the regime wanted to keep him away from younger activists arriving on Robben Island. The conditions were less brutal, but the isolation more profound. From here, quiet, secretive talks began between Mandela and government officials, probing conversations about the country's future, about whether peace could be achieved without civil war. Meanwhile, the world outside was reaching a boiling point. Protests grew in intensity. The United Nations condemned apartheid as a crime against humanity. Cultural and sports boycotts deepened South Africa's isolation. Even some within the white establishment began to see that the system could not survive forever. In 1988, Mandela was moved again, this time to Victor Verster Prison, where the restrictions eased slightly. Here, he could meet visitors more freely, and the government used the appearance of improved conditions as propaganda. But in reality, negotiations were intensifying. The apartheid regime was cornered, and Mandela, though still a prisoner, was becoming an equal partner in deciding the fate of the nation. On February 2, 1990, President F.W. de Klerk announced the unbanning of the ANC and other liberation movements. The words rippled across the country like a shockwave. 9 days later, the world's cameras focused on the gates of Victor Verster. When Mandela emerged tall and dignified in a dark suit, holding Winnie's hand, it was as though the air itself shifted. After 27 years in captivity, he walked free, not as a broken man, but as a living embodiment of resilience. Yet freedom was only the beginning of a new and dangerous chapter. The country was still on a knife's edge, its streets roiling with political violence, its future uncertain. Mandela now had to step from the shadows of prison into the blinding light of leadership, knowing that the next moves he made could either lead South Africa into peace or into civil war. The months after Mandela's release were a blur of movement, negotiation, and danger. South Africa was a nation in transition, yet violence stalked its streets. In townships across the country, clashes erupted between ANC supporters and those aligned with the Inkatha Freedom Party, often stoked by covert elements within the state security forces. The fear was palpable. After decades of oppression, the path to freedom could still be washed away in blood. Mandela threw himself into the talks that would decide the nation's fate. In grand conference rooms and discreet back channels, he faced his former jailers now dressed in suits, men who had once seen him as an enemy to be crushed. Across the table sat President F.W. de Klerk, whose decision to release Mandela and legalize the ANC had shocked the world. The two men shared a wary respect, bound by the recognition that the alternative to negotiation was chaos. But the talks were fraught with mistrust. At times, Mandela accused the government of acting in bad faith, pointing to the continued violence and the slow pace of dismantling apartheid's machinery. De Klerk, for his part, pushed back against what he saw as ANC intransigence. Yet, despite the tensions, the dialogue inched forward. Mandela's patience, honed in prison, became his greatest weapon. He understood that to bring peace, he would have to balance the rage of the oppressed with the fear of those who had long held power. In 1991, Mandela was elected president of the African National Congress, taking over from Oliver Tambo, whose health had been broken by years in exile. The symbolic weight of that moment was immense. The man once labeled a terrorist by his own government now led the very movement that was poised to reshape the nation. Yet the dangers multiplied. In 1993, Chris Hani, a beloved ANC leader, was assassinated by a white extremist. The killing threatened to ignite widespread unrest. Mandela addressed the nation on television, his voice steady, urging calm, appealing to South Africans to unite against the forces that sought to derail peace. His ability to step into the role of statesman in moments of crisis became one of his defining strengths. That same year, Mandela and de Klerk were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in ending apartheid. The ceremony in Oslo was both a triumph and a reminder. The hardest part was still ahead. Negotiations continued to hammer out the details of a new constitution, one that would guarantee equal rights for all South Africans regardless of race. The talks were arduous, often near collapse, but by April 1994, the course was set. On April 27, 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections. Millions of citizens, many of whom had never before been allowed to vote, stood in lines that snaked for miles, some waiting for more than 12 hours. The mood was electric, an entire nation holding its breath. When the results came in, they were decisive. The ANC had won by a landslide. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, prisoner number 466/64, became the first black president of South Africa. His inauguration on May 10, 1994, was a scene once unimaginable. In the Union Buildings of Pretoria, before a crowd of thousands and an audience of millions around the globe, Mandela stood in a dark suit, sunlight on his face, and took the oath of office. Fighter jets that had once flown in defense of apartheid now soared in salute to the birth of a new democracy. In a speech, he declared, "Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will experience the oppression of one by another." As president, Mandela faced challenges that could have shattered the fragile unity. The country's economy bore the scars of sanctions and inequality. Millions lived in poverty, without access to basic services. Crime surged. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, sought to confront the crimes of the past without plunging the nation into vengeance. Victims told their stories. Perpetrators confessed in exchange for amnesty. It was a process both painful and cathartic, emblematic of Mandela's belief that justice and healing had to walk hand in hand. He served only one term, stepping down in 1999, honoring his promise that leadership was a trust, not a possession. Retirement did not still his voice. He campaigned against HIV/AIDS, spoke for peace in conflict zones, and continued to inspire movements for justice worldwide. His moral authority transcended borders. Leaders and citizens alike looked to him as proof that dignity could survive even the longest captivity. In his later years, Mandela withdrew from public life, spending time with his family, including his grandchildren, in the rural quiet of Kunu. His health declined, but his presence remained a touchstone for the nation. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela died at the age of 95. The news spread instantly, and across South Africa, candles were lit, songs were sung, and tears flowed freely. The world mourned not just a leader, but a man whose life had been a testament to courage, forgiveness, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Even in death, his legacy endured. Streets, schools, and institutions bore his name. His words continued to inspire those who face oppression in any form. The man who had once been called a troublemaker had indeed pulled at the branches of the great tree of injustice, until it cracked, until it fell, until light poured to where darkness had reigned. And though his journey had ended, the ideals for which he had stood, democracy, equality, and human dignity, remain as unshakable as the hills of the Transkei where it had all begun.